Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Star here with you again, and we are going to be looking at some of the Greek mythology. We need to learn if some of the Greek mythology is real or if it was just a completely made up story. And so we're going to be covering a couple of I can statements you can see today, looking at the causes for development in the Mediterranean area, looking for some of the characteristics of the civilizations that we find here, specifically the Greek civilizations, and then we'll be looking at some of the causes of their decline eventually as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it here, guys. For our activity today, you're going to be working on a chart that looks a little bit like this. We've got a number of different topics on the left-hand side, and I'm going to ask that at the very beginning here today, you fill in the beginning that says what you either know about that topic already, what you can observe from the picture that we're going to show you in just a second, and then what your question is. What kind of question comes up after you observe that picture and look at that? And then together we'll go through and you'll be able to fill in from what we learn in the notes here about what you've learned, and then you'll be able to write down whether it was myth or whether it was real as we go through. So you can see we've got 5 of them on this first list here, and so we're going to be taking a look at those 5. The first one here, guys, we have is the story of Europa. I want you to kind of take a look. If you don't know anything about this already, I want you to take a look at the picture and kind of see what you could observe. After each one of these pictures here, you could pause the video and write down your information in those first 2 columns there. All right, so story of Europa is our first one. Our second one is what we call the existence of Minoan civilization, whether or not you know anything about it and what you can observe from this picture. Again, you can pause if you need to right here to write more information down. The next one is the existence of the palace Knossos. All right, what can you observe or what do you already know about it? Write those down, and again, pause if you need to. The next we have is the warrior kings of Mycenae. What do you know about them, if anything? Or what can you observe from this picture here? The existence of long-distance trade. You may know something about this already, since we've already talked about a couple of different civilizations. So again, write down what you can observe or what you know, and then write down the questions that you have. The Trojan War is another topic here we have. What do you know about it, if anything? And if you don't know anything, what can you observe from the picture? Going a little bit more in depth on the Trojan War, what about the Trojan horse? What do you know about it, or what can you observe from the picture here? And then what questions do you have after looking at it? The warrior named Achilles. Do you know anything about Achilles? And if you don't know anything, again, what can you observe from the picture here? And then what kind of questions might arise that you have? The voyage of Odysseus. What do you know about the voyage of Odysseus? Or what can you observe from the picture here? And then any questions you have. And then finally, we look at the Dorian invasion of Greece. All right, so write down any questions you may have, write down what you can observe, or if anything that you know about the Dorian invasion of Greece. Again, you can pause in between each of those pictures right there. And when you're ready, you can go ahead and hit play, and we'll go ahead and take a look at our information here for each. So ladies and gentlemen, we're going to come back here now. Hopefully you've gotten your information for those first 2 columns written down, and we're going to start kind of filling in our information for what you know. So I want you to write in this column right here, the learned column. You're going to write down your information, your notes, and then when we tell you if it's myth or real, you can write down M or R in the last column there as well. All right, let's go ahead and go through it. So we're looking at the story of Europa. And if you don't know anything about the story of Europa, obviously we've seen a couple different times that it is about a woman named Europa. We've seen her a couple times now. She was a Phoenician princess. And the story is that Zeus fell in love with her. All right, Zeus being the king of the gods. Zeus was so in love with her that he decided to abduct her so that he could be with her. And he brought her to the island of Crete. All right, so this is kind of the story. Obviously, we know for sure that there's a little bit of factual information here because Europe obviously will gain its name from the story of Europa. But is this story overall accurate? We also know that there's an element of truth when we look at the cradle of civilization. A lot of historians and archaeologists believe that Crete is a very important spot for kind of the beginning of civilization. And so if we look at this, myth or real, this is a myth. All right. It's possible there was a Phoenician princess named Europa, but we have no evidence of this. And obviously, you add Zeus into it, and it's most likely going to be mythology. Our next one is the existence of Minoan civilization. We look at the Minoan civilization here. What we do know about it is there has been evidence of a civilization that was found on Crete. It was named after King Minos. And we know that they would have traded the Aegean world pretty heavily. They traded with all the other people and groups in the Aegean world. All right. We also would know that if this existed, it would have reached the height of its civilization right around 1750 to 1500 from the evidence that has been found. All right. So if we look at this, is the existence of a Minoan civilization on Crete myth or real? And this is real. Okay. So we're kind of going a little bit more in depth on the Minoan civilization then. And so what do we know about the Palace of Knossos? And so when we look at the Palace Knossos here, this was said to be or rumored to be part of the Minoan civilization. It's where the rulers of the Minoan civilization would have lived. And it had supposedly many, many rooms inside this palace. It had religious shrines. It had these large, large banquet halls. It had painted walls. And when we come down to it, yes, it was real. This did exist. They even say it's possible that Palace of Knossos may have had running water inside of it. So we've already seen that a little bit with the Indus River Valley as well, right? The Mohenjo-Daran civilization. So the Palace of Knossos was definitely real. We talk about the warrior kings of Mycenae. And so you've already seen a little bit about the warrior kings. And so we get a little bit more information. It was said that they would have been Indo-European, similar to the Indo-Aryans, but that group went a different direction than the people from Mohenjo-Daro. It said that they conquered Greece and then moved into Crete, that they would have been the first Greek-speaking people if they did in fact exist, and that they were sea traders. And finally, we look at this group that they were ruled by a group of kings, or over time, a group of kings that were known as warriors. There was a warrior society. All right, so we look at whether they were myth or real. They were indeed real. Okay, so the warrior kings of Mycenae, real group, a real civilization in Crete. Next one we have, guys, is long distance trade. Looking at the long distance trade options here, we saw the map a little earlier, and we've talked a lot about things like the Silk Road already in Unit 2. So when it comes down to long distance trade, we believe that there's evidence of trade between Rome, Greece, and Egypt. We found information. We found artifacts in Sicily and Italy from Egypt. We found information and artifacts from Greece and Egypt and so on. And so when we look at Mesopotamia and Greece and Rome and Egypt and even all the way to China and India, we definitely see that there is long distance trade. So long distance trade is definitely real. The next one we have here is the conflict of Troy versus the Mycenaeans, and we call that the Trojan War. You can see Troy is located just up here, kind of the eastern side of the Aegean, and it's at the entrance. They call it the Hellespont and the Bosporus, the entrance to the Black Sea. So it was a strategically important route and spot. And so when we look at it, was the Trojan War actually real? We call it, like we said, this conflict is called the Trojan War. We know that there is at least one little element of myth here, and that is that the idea that the Trojan War was fought over a woman. The story is that Helen was a queen from Sparta, and she was so beautiful that one of the Trojans kind of abducted her and took her back to Troy, and she became known as Helen of Troy. And that is why we have the Trojan War, is that the Spartan king wanted his queen back. And so they say that Helen was so beautiful, she had the face that launched 1,000 ships. All right, we know that there is at least a little bit of myth here, whether or not the whole thing is myth or real. All right, we look at it from a realistic standpoint, and it's possible that a war would have been fought because of its strategic location, the city of Troy. It was right here at the Dardanelles, like we said, the Hellespont and the Bosporus, and it controlled basically trade, anything going east for Greece. And so that would have been a very strategically important spot. And so we look at this. This is definitely real. Now, again, there's a lot of elements of myth here with this war as well, but the war itself was actually fought. They have found evidence that this was a war here. There was a war here. The next one we look at is the Trojan horse. All right, so it's said that this war, the Trojan War, lasted for 10 years, and the way the Greeks eventually won the war is they snuck this Trojan horse inside, or they allowed the Trojans to bring this horse inside, and it was supposed to be a gift to the gods. And then inside that horse was a bunch of Trojan soldiers. All right, so they all hid inside and offered this as a gift to the Trojans. Rather than fighting, they decided to sneak in. And when night came, the Greeks came out of the horse and burned the entire city down. All right, now we know there's a little bit of element of truth here, and that's because we just talked about the city of Troy did exist at some point. A man named Heinrich Schliemann actually found the city, and he found that there was evidence that the city at one point had been burned to the ground. And so there's a possibility that this is true. And when we look at it, we know that the Trojan horse has become kind of a popular saying. People talk about like the computer virus, a Trojan computer virus, is something that kind of sneaks into your computer and hides there until it activates, just like the Trojan horse would. And so when we look at the myth or real aspect here, we actually believe this is myth. There's no evidence besides a book that was written called the Iliad, or a poem that was written called the Iliad, that the Trojan horse ever existed. And so there is no artifacts, there is no record that this actually happened. It's a great story, but we're not sure it actually happened. The next one we have is the warrior named Achilles. All right, so when we take a look at Achilles, Achilles was a Greek hero. He was dipped in the river Styx as a baby, and you can see that's what's going on in the picture there. The Fates had picked him up, and you can see they held him by his ankles, and they dipped him in the river Styx, and when they dipped him in the river Styx, that made him invulnerable, made him basically invincible in all but one spot, and that's the spot that she was holding on to when she dipped him in, at his ankle, or his Achilles. They say that what happened here during the Trojan War is that his best friend was killed. If you've ever seen the movie Troy, they call this, instead of best friend, they call it his cousin. Most historians would say that it was most likely a lover that was killed in battle, in war. And so what eventually happens is the story is that he goes kind of crazy, and he basically goes and kills the Trojan heir, all right, to the throne in battle. Eventually what happens is Achilles, who had been this amazing warrior in Greece, eventually is shot in the heel with an arrow. And when he's shot in the heel, that kills him, because that was the only spot that he was not dipped into the river Styx. All right, so when we look at Achilles, we do know there's a little bit of element of truth. The popular saying that has come out, the idea that if you say it's my Achilles heel, that means it's usually your weakness or something you're not good at. All right, and so when we talk about myth or real, the warrior Achilles ultimately is a myth. All right, we don't know if there was a warrior named Achilles. It's very possible that there was, but obviously he was not invulnerable. He was not a demigod. He was not invincible from being killed, except for his heel. Okay. Next one we have is the voyage of Odysseus. When we talk about Odysseus, we think of the poem by Homer called the Odyssey. And so the Greek hero of Homer's Odyssey was Odysseus. Now, the Odyssey takes place after the 10-year-long Trojan War. The Iliad is actually Homer's first poem that he wrote, and then the Odyssey is the second. We know that there's at least some factual basis to the Iliad. And so let's take a closer look at the Odyssey here. And it's possible you guys read this last year in class as well, in English class. We look at the Odyssey as the return story, or the story of the return home from the Trojan War for Odysseus, one of the generals and the king of Ithaca. We do know that it's filled with monsters and different mythological aspects, like cyclops and witches and sea beasts. And so when we look at the voyage of Odysseus, ultimately, the major piece of element that we know of truth is the Trojan War. We know the Trojan War actually happened, but when it comes down to it, Odysseus is probably a myth in the voyage of the Odyssey. There is no evidence that even the kingdom of Ithaca ever existed, or a general or king known as Odysseus existed either. All right, it's a great story, but we don't know that it was ever true, obviously. And then there's obviously the monsters and things that add to the myth. Last but certainly not least, ladies and gentlemen, we have the Dorian invasion. And so when we look at the Dorian invasion, the story is that there was a group of people that came in and invaded Greece, and they ushered in kind of what we call the Dark Age. They had um, no writing language or written language. They had no real contact with any other groups. And it said that they came in and they were kind of warriors, and they ushered in the Dark Ages of Greece. All right, kind of brought along this uh, anti-people, anti-education into Greece. And when we look at that, this is actually real. And it's said that a specific group of people go on to become the ancestors or go on to become the people that were related to the Dorians, and that is the Spartans. And so we'll talk more about the Spartans later on here as well in Unit 3. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is it. Hopefully you completed your entire chart. If you haven't, go back, finish things up. If you have to pause or rewind or whatever you need to do, but make sure you finish up that chart. There will be some information on your quizzes and tests based on the myth or real activity here. Have a good one.